What's up, people? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast. So let's get started at Portugal, a founding NATO member, host of American military bases, a country that never once wavered from the transatlantic alliance, just had its president step to a podium and call Trump, in precise and deliberate language, a Russian asset. Not a rival, not a difficult partner. An asset, the language of spycraft and betrayal, spoken publicly, on the record, by a 7-decade ally. And Washington's response wasn't to ask why, it was to brand Portugal an enemy and treat a treaty ally like a hostile power. That's not a diplomatic spat, that's the canary in the coal mine. And it has stopped singing. Let me reconstruct the exact sequence of events that brought us to this breaking point, because the details paint a picture far more alarming than any headline can capture. We're in the late summer at a venue called Castelo de Vide, a historic town in the Portuguese countryside. The sitting president of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, takes the stage to address an audience gathered to discuss European security, the grinding war in Ukraine, and America's evolving role on the world stage under its returning leadership. The atmosphere is likely serious, scholarly even, the kind of setting where diplomatic language usually rules the day and controversial statements are carefully sanded down until they're smooth enough to offend no one. But Marcelo didn't reach for the sandpaper. He reached for a sledgehammer. Standing before that audience with cameras recording every syllable, he declared that the supreme leader of the world's most powerful nation functions as a Soviet or Russian asset. He said Trump's actions consistently, objectively serve Moscow's interests, regardless of whether that service is intentional or accidental. In the lexicon of intelligence professionals, that's what the word asset ultimately means. It describes someone whose behavior advances the goals of a foreign power, whether they're a recruited spy, a useful idiot, or something in between. The president of Portugal looked at the available evidence and drew a conclusion so severe, so diplomatically radioactive, that it shattered every norm governing how allied leaders speak about each other in public. Now, I can already hear the pushback forming in some of your minds. You're thinking this is just one politician running his mouth. You're wondering why anyone should care what the leader of a small European nation thinks about American politics. That reaction is understandable, but it's also dangerously naive about how international alliances actually function. Portugal isn't just some random country with an opinion. Portugal is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance forged in the ashes of World War II to protect Western democracy from exactly the kind of Russian aggression we're witnessing today. Portugal hosts American military installations on its territory, installations that project American power into the Mediterranean, into North Africa, into the broader Atlantic. Portuguese soldiers have fought alongside American soldiers. Portuguese diplomats have coordinated with American diplomats across decades of global crises. When a nation with that depth of shared history, with that level of ongoing military cooperation, with that much skin in the game of Western security, decides that the American president is behaving like an asset of the Kremlin, that's not a random insult you can dismiss with a wave of your hand. That's a diplomatic earthquake registering on a Richter scale we've never seen before in the modern era of alliance politics. The response from the Trump camp and the broader conservative media ecosystem arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Within hours, MAGA influencers and commentators began framing Portugal not as a wayward friend in need of correction, but as an outright enemy of the American people. The rhetoric escalated with dizzying speed. The Portuguese president's remarks were labeled hostile, anti-American, a direct attack on the legitimacy of the administration. Conservative voices started asking aloud whether Portugal even deserved to remain inside the NATO alliance if its leadership was going to sling accusations of treason at the commander-in-chief of its most powerful member. The framing was unequivocal. Disagreement was being recoded as betrayal. Criticism was being reclassified as enemy action. The subtle but crucial distinction between an ally who voices hard truths and an adversary who seeks destruction was being deliberately erased, and in its place was rising a new and dangerous doctrine where any ally that breaks ranks must be treated as a target. But the story deepens in ways that make the initial statement look almost tame, because the Portuguese government itself, the institutional machinery of the state, was thrown into chaos by its own president's words. A fascinating and largely unreported internal fracture opened up for the world to see. Henrique Ego Elo, identified as a frontrunner for the next Portuguese presidency, stepped forward to publicly rebuke Marcelo. He argued that a sitting president represents the entire Portuguese state, not just his personal opinions, and that making such inflammatory personal attacks against the leader of a vital ally was reckless and dangerous. He warned that those remarks could trigger a severe diplomatic conflict with Washington, one that tiny Portugal could ill afford against the colossal weight of the American superpower. Simultaneously, from the right wing of Portuguese politics, a leader named André Ventura called the comments extremely imprudent. He cautioned that Marcelo was dragging Portugal into unnecessary clashes with the United States.
First of all, the drone and missile strikes that took place overnight in Ukraine. General Keith Kellogg, the president's special envoy, has described these attacks as egregious. Do you agree with that description? And do you view President Putin as an impediment to getting peace between these two countries?
Well, it's not about if I agree, it's about what the president thinks. And I know what the president thinks because I talked to him about this. He was not happy about this news, but he was also not surprised. These are two countries that have been at war for a very long time. Russia
picking a fight that served no Portuguese national interest and risked making the country a punching bag in America's internal political circus. So even within Portugal, the country was split. Half the political establishment was effectively saying their own president had gone too far, that the truth, even if privately believed, shouldn't be shouted from the rooftops when the cost is the destruction of a 75-year-old security partnership. But why did this happen?
Launched this attack on Kyiv, and likewise, Ukraine recently dealt a blow to Russia's oil refineries. They have taken out, as a matter of fact, 20% of Russia's oil refinery capacity over the course of their attacks throughout the month of August. So the president is continuing to watch this intently, and this killing, unfortunately, will continue as long as the war continues, which is why the president wants it to end. And that's why he's worked harder than anyone to end this war, which would have never started if he were president. But perhaps both sides of this war are not ready to end it themselves. The president wants it to end, but the leaders of these two countries need it to end and want it to end, must want it to end as well. And I think the president will make some additional statements on this later.
My question has to do with, I just had one more, if I may. It has to do with the president's intention to remove Lisa Cook as a member of the Federal Reserve Board. He is going or acting upon allegations that have been made by Trump administration official Bill Pulte. These are just allegations. She hasn't been convicted yet of any crime. Is the administration opposed to allowing Ms. Cook to have due process, to challenge what has been alleged?
Why did a normally reserved European statesman feel compelled to break every rule in the diplomatic handbook? The answer lies not in Lisbon, but in the pattern of behavior flowing from Washington that has driven even the quietest allies to a point of utter desperation. European leaders spent months watching the new administration systematically dismantle the foundations of transatlantic trust. They watched as tariffs ranging from 10 to 25% were slapped onto European goods, hammering German automakers, French wine exporters, Italian luxury brands, and Portuguese manufacturers with equal indifference. They listened in stunned disbelief as serious discussions emerged from the White House about purchasing or even seizing Greenland, a territory belonging to the Kingdom of Denmark, another NATO ally. The message couldn't have been clearer. The sovereignty of allies mattered less than the whims of the American president. And most critically, they observed the posture toward the war in Ukraine, the bleeding wound on Europe's eastern flank that has defined continental security since the full-scale Russian invasion began. To European eyes, the shift was unmistakable. The American president was talking about ending the war quickly through direct negotiations with Putin. He was questioning whether weapons shipments to Kyiv should continue indefinitely. He was floating the idea that Ukraine might need to surrender territory as the price of peace. He was meeting with the Russian leader and emerging with smiles and handshakes, while European leaders watched their worst security nightmare unfold on their own doorstep. In that context, Marcelo's Russian asset comment wasn't a random insult. It was a diagnosis, a blunt clinical assessment of a pattern so consistent that it begged for explanation. He was verbalizing what countless European officials had been whispering in private for months, that Trump's actions were objectively, functionally serving the Kremlin's strategic agenda, whether by design, by naivety, or by something more troubling. Then came the escalation that truly transformed this from a war of words into a structural realignment. In the opening weeks of the new year, the Portuguese government stopped merely commenting on Trump and started actively organizing against him. Lisbon formally urged the European Union to craft what they called a united and very strong response to Trump's tariff regime. They pushed for collective European resistance not just on trade, but also on the Greenland question, framing Trump's territorial talk as a direct challenge to the sovereignty of NATO member states that required a unified rebuke from the entire bloc. Around the same time, former high-ranking officials from the European Union began speaking to the press in terms so grim they would have been unthinkable in any previous era. They described transatlantic ties as being at the lowest point in NATO history, the lowest point ever reached in 75 years of an alliance that had weathered the Berlin blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iraq war splits, and the financial meltdown. None of those existential crises had managed to push the alliance to the precipice, but the current moment had. Let's pause there, because that phrase deserves its own spotlight. The lowest point in NATO history. This isn't hyperbole from a cable news pundit trying to fill airtime. This is a structural assessment from people who spent entire careers managing the transatlantic relationship. They are telling us that the glue which bound the democratic world together through the 20th century's darkest hours is dissolving in real time, and the solvent is American behavior. The consequences of that dissolution are almost too vast to contemplate. Every security arrangement, every intelligence sharing agreement, every coordinated diplomatic strategy that relies on trust between Washington and European capitals is now operating on borrowed time. Now let me be scrupulously fair, because intellectual honesty demands we examine the counter-arguments that Trump's defenders marshal against this narrative. They will argue, correctly, that a sitting president of an allied nation calling the American commander-in-chief a Russian asset is itself a massive breach of diplomatic protocol, one that arguably inflicted the first wound in this conflict. They'll point out that Marcelo's own countrymen criticized him for it, that the frontrunner to replace him and the leader of a major right-wing party both said he had gone too far. They'll contend that Trump's push for Europe to pay more for its own defense is a legitimate grievance that stretches back across multiple American presidencies, and that European outrage over tariffs is hypocrisy from a continent that has long maintained its own protectionist barriers against American goods. They'll argue that seeking a negotiated end to the Ukraine war, even if it requires painful compromises, is not treason but statecraft, and that calling it evidence of being a Russian asset is a smear designed to delegitimize a president who refuses to play by the stale rules of the Washington foreign policy establishment. These arguments are not unsubstantial. They carry weight with people who genuinely believe Europe has been freeloading on American military might for a generation. But here's where those defenses buckle under the weight of the broader pattern. If it were only Portugal, only one eccentric president with a penchant for blunt language, you could dismiss this as an outlier. But Portugal is not alone. It is merely the loudest voice in a growing chorus. Across the continent, capitals are quietly adjusting their risk calculations, hedging against the possibility that the American security guarantee can no longer be taken as an article of faith. When an entire continent of your closest historical friends starts acting like they need to protect themselves from you, it's no longer sufficient to blame a single Portuguese politician for having a loose tongue. Something systemic is driving this. And the response from the Trump camp, the branding of Portugal as an enemy, is a dangerous feedback loop that accelerates the very collapse it claims to lament. By treating allied criticism as enemy action, the administration makes it impossible to repair the relationship. Diplomacy is replaced by retaliation. Dialogue is replaced by threats. And every cycle of this escalatory spiral pushes Portugal and nations watching from the sidelines further away from Washington and closer toward alternative power centers like Beijing. Which brings us to the specter haunting the edges of this entire controversy, the possibility that this rhetorical war could eventually metastasize into legal warfare. The idea of an international arrest warrant targeting American officials sounds like the plot of a geopolitical thriller, something too extreme to exist outside the realm of fiction. But the runway lights for that possibility are already blinking red. Trump has a documented history of all-out war with international courts. During his first term, his administration slapped sanctions on officials of the International Criminal Court after the ICC began probing American actions in Afghanistan and Israeli actions in Palestinian territories. The message was clear: any international legal body that tries to hold Americans accountable will face the full wrath of American power. European capitals, meanwhile, have been pushing for years in the opposite direction, demanding that international law apply to everyone, that mass atrocities and treaty violations should trigger arrest warrants regardless of the perpetrator's passport. Now layer in the current cocktail of crises: the ongoing war in Iran, various controversies swirling around the Gaza conflict, and the unprecedented spectacle of a NATO ally publicly labeling the American president as a Russian asset. In that combustible environment, the notion that some European prosecutor or judge might eventually seek legal action against American officials is no longer pure fantasy. It's a distant but distinct shape forming on the horizon. Portugal's open hostility adds jet fuel to that fire. If European governments are increasingly willing to break with Washington publicly, the political barriers that once prevented them from supporting international legal accountability mechanisms start to crumble. The arrest warrant, even if it never materializes tomorrow or next month, now haunts the realm of the possible in a way it simply didn't before. So who actually wins in this slow-motion train wreck? Who benefits from the spectacle of America and its oldest friends tearing into each other on the global stage? The answer is brutally simple and entirely bipartisan. Moscow wins. Vladimir Putin has spent the better part of 2 decades trying to accomplish exactly what is now unfolding before his eyes. He wanted NATO fractured. He wanted the European Union and the United States at each other's throats. He wanted the democratic alliance system so paralyzed by internal conflict that it couldn't effectively resist his adventures in Ukraine or anywhere else. Every screaming headline about Portugal versus Trump, every social media post from a MAGA influencer calling for Portugal's expulsion from NATO, every Portuguese diplomat drafting plans for EU retaliation against American tariffs is a gift wrapped in a bow and delivered directly to the Kremlin. Russia doesn't have to lift a finger to divide the West when the West is eagerly doing the job itself. Beijing benefits almost as much. China has been executing a patient generational strategy to expand its influence in Europe through infrastructure investment, technology partnerships, and trade relationships. It positions itself as the stable, predictable, reliable partner that America used to be. When Washington is fighting with Lisbon and Brussels over tariffs and insults, Beijing is in the background offering a calm alternative, and European leaders, desperate for relationships that don't feel like emotional roller coasters, are listening. The losers in this equation are almost too numerous to count. Regular American citizens lose because a world without strong alliances is a world where every crisis must be faced alone, at vastly higher cost in blood and treasure. Regular European citizens lose because their security architecture, built and maintained for 3 generations under the American nuclear umbrella, suddenly looks terrifyingly fragile. The people of Ukraine lose most of all, because a West that is consumed with fighting itself is a West that cannot sustain the long-term military and economic support needed to resist Russian aggression. The entire architecture of democratic solidarity that won the Cold War and kept the peace into the 21st century is being auctioned off for the short-term satisfaction of political grievance. Where does this road lead us if the current trajectory continues unchallenged? Several futures branch off from this inflection point. The most optimistic scenario, which currently requires a great deal of imagination, involves a course correction where the administration recognizes that alienating every major ally simultaneously is a strategic catastrophe and moderates its approach to tariff policy and Ukraine negotiations. In this timeline, the Portugal remarks become a wake-up call rather than a deeper wound, and the slow work of diplomatic repair begins. A darker but still plausible scenario sees the tension continue to simmer at its current level, punctuated by occasional cooperative moments on specific issues where interests align, but with the underlying trust permanently damaged. The darkest timeline, the one that increasingly looks like the default setting, involves continued escalation. More ally presidents follow Portugal's lead and publicly question America's reliability or leadership. The administration responds by branding more allies as enemies, imposing more punitive tariffs, and demanding more concessions as the price of protection. European coordination against American interests intensifies. The alliance system hollows out until it exists only on paper. forever, a zombie institution incapable of coordinated action. And into the vacuum, Moscow and Beijing expand their influence over Europe, reshaping the global order in a way that makes America less safe, less prosperous, and less relevant with each passing month. Here's the uncomfortable truth that every American needs to wrestle with tonight. Allies don't typically turn on each other without cause. Nations that have stood side by side through world wars and cold wars and terrorist attacks don't suddenly start calling each other's leaders intelligence assets just for sport. Portugal's president didn't wake up one random morning and decide his life's mission was to antagonize the most powerful man on earth. Something forced that speech. Something in the pattern of American behavior, in the tariffs, in the Greenland talk, in the Ukraine posture, in the signals being sent from the White House, convinced a normally friendly leader that the relationship had been damaged so severely that only a blunt and public warning could possibly salvage it. You can disagree with Marcelo's words. You can believe he should have chosen different language, found a quieter channel, used more diplomatic phrasing. But you cannot honestly engage with this moment by pretending his warning materialized out of thin air. The warning has a source, and that source is a growing European consensus that America under its current leadership has become a threat to the very alliance system it once led. This is the question that should haunt you long after you close this video or scroll past this story. What kind of world are we building right now, in this news cycle, with these policy choices, for the generations that will inherit our decisions? Are we constructing a future where American children grow up in a country surrounded by friends, anchored in a web of strong alliances that make every challenge easier to face? Or are we constructing a future where America stands isolated, having burned through 75 years of goodwill in a handful of years, facing a world of rivals alone because we forgot that allies are not servants to be commanded but partners to be respected? The Portugal crisis is not a distant foreign story that only matters to diplomats in Brussels. It is a window into that future, and right now the view through that window is dark. The branding of Portugal as an enemy represents more than just overheated rhetoric. It represents a fundamental reorientation of how America sees the world and how the world sees America in return. And once those perceptions solidify, once allies become enemies in the public imagination, the road back to friendship is measured not in election cycles, but in generations, assuming the road remains passable at all. The ghost of the NATO alliance is walking among us, and we are the ones writing its obituary, one broken friendship at a time.